Welcome. It's good that you're here. You've found a quiet place, and that's enough. There's nothing you need to do now except rest. This is a story about the Roman Empire, but it's told gently, without urgency. You don't need to remember any of it. You don't need to stay awake. If you drift away, that's exactly right. The story will continue whether you're listening or not, and that's how it should be. Let's begin somewhere peaceful. Let's begin with the land itself. Italy is a long peninsula that reaches down into the Mediterranean Sea. If you were to look at it from above, you might think it resembles a boot, though the Romans themselves never described it that way. They simply called it Italia. The peninsula is bordered by mountains to the north, the great curve of the Alps, which separate Italy from the rest of Europe. Down the centre of Italy runs another mountain range, the Apennines, a gentler set of peaks and hills that form the spine of the land. Between these mountains and the coasts are plains and valleys. The soil in many of these places is good. It grows wheat and barley, olives and grapes. The climate is warm in summer, mild in winter, though it varies from north to south. In the north, near the mountains, winters can be cold. In the south, the sun is stronger, the land drier. Rivers flow down from the mountains toward the sea. One of these rivers is called the Tiber. It is not the longest river, nor the widest, but it flows through the region called Latium, and it was along the banks of this river that a settlement began, many centuries ago. That settlement would become Rome. The landscape around Rome is made of 7 hills. These hills are not dramatic. They rise gently from the plain, covered in grass and scrub, and between them are valleys where streams once flowed. The hills have names: the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Querinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, the Caelian, and the Aventine. People began to live on these hills because they were easier to defend than the flatlands, and because the Tiber nearby provided water and a route for trade. The first people who lived in this area were part of a group called the Latins. They spoke an early form of the Latin language. They farmed, kept animals, built simple houses from wood and mud and thatch. They buried their dead or burned them, placing the ashes in urns. Their lives were shaped by the seasons, by the need to plant and harvest, by the rhythms of the weather. There were other peoples in Italy at this time. To the north, in the region called Etruria, lived the Etruscans, a people with their own language and culture, quite different from the Latins. The Etruscans were skilled metalworkers and traders. They built cities, painted tombs, and worshipped gods whose names we still know. To the south, Greek colonists had begun to settle along the coasts, founding cities like Neapolis and Tarentum. These Greeks brought their own traditions, their own stories and gods. Italy, then, was not a unified place. It was a patchwork of different peoples, languages, and customs, all living side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, mostly just continuing with the work of survival. In the midst of this, the small settlement on the 7 hills grew slowly. According to Roman tradition, the city of Rome was founded in the year 753 before the Common Era. This date was calculated much later by Roman scholars, and it may not be exact, but it gives us a sense of when the Romans believed their story began. The early Romans told stories about their origins. One of these stories involved a man named Aeneas, a hero from the city of Troy. According to the tale, after Troy was destroyed in a great war, Aeneas fled with a group of survivors. He travelled across the sea, guided by the gods, and eventually reached Italy. He settled in Latium and married a local princess. His descendants, the story goes, became the founders of Rome. Another story tells of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were abandoned as infants and left to die by the banks of the Tiber. A she-wolf found them and nursed them. Later, a shepherd discovered the boys and raised them. When they grew up, they decided to found a city. They disagreed about where to build it, and in the quarrel that followed, Romulus killed Remus. Romulus then founded the city and gave it his name, Rome. These stories are myths, not history, but they mattered to the Romans. They gave meaning to the city's origins. They connected Rome to older, grander traditions, to the heroes of Troy, and to the idea of divine favor. The Romans believed that their city had been chosen, that it had a destiny. Whether or not Romulus ever existed, there were certainly people living on the Palatine Hill and the other hills around the Tiber in the 8th century before the Common Era. They built huts, farmed the land, raised families. Over time, these separate hilltop communities began to come together, to trade and intermarry, to share festivals and rituals. Gradually, they formed a single community. This process was slow and undramatic. It took generations. The early Romans were governed by kings. There were 7 of them, according to tradition. The first was Romulus. After him came Numa Pompilius, who was remembered as a peaceful king, a lawgiver who established many of Rome's religious customs. Then came Tullus Hostilius, a more warlike figure, and Ancus Marcius, who expanded Roman territory and founded the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. The last 3 kings were said to be Etruscan, or at least influenced by Etruscan culture. Their names were Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. These kings transformed Rome. They built temples and monuments, drained the swampy valley between the hills to create the Forum, a public space where people could gather. They built the Cloaca Maxima, a great sewer that channeled water away from the city. They constructed walls and roads. Rome, under these kings, was no longer just a collection of villages. It was becoming a city. The Forum was the heart of this growing city. It sat in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Before the kings drained it, this valley was marshy, prone to flooding when the Tiber rose. The water made the land unusable for much of the year. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drain, changed this. It was built as a channel, lined with stone, running through the valley and out to the river. The water was carried away, and the Forum became dry ground. In the Forum, people gathered. Markets were held there. Legal disputes were settled there. Religious ceremonies took place there. It was a public space, open to all citizens, a place where the community came together. Over time, buildings rose around the Forum. Temples were built to honor the gods. A meeting house was constructed for the Senate. Shops and workshops lined the edges. The temples were simple at first, built in the Etruscan style, with wooden columns and terracotta decorations. Later they would be rebuilt in stone and marble, but in the early days, they were modest structures. The most important temple was dedicated to Jupiter, the king of the gods. It stood on the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Forum. Jupiter was the protector of Rome, the god of sky and thunder, the one who witnessed oaths and treaties. Religion was not separate from daily life. It was woven into everything. Before any important action, the gods were consulted. Priests would examine the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, looking for signs of divine approval or disapproval. These signs, called omens, guided decisions. If the omens were bad, plans would be postponed or changed. The Romans believed that the gods were watching, that they had opinions, that they could help or hinder. Every household had its own gods as well. The lares were spirits of the household, protectors of the family. The penates guarded the storeroom, ensuring there was always food. Each day, the head of the household would make small offerings to these gods, a bit of food, a splash of wine. It was a way of maintaining good relations, of showing respect, of hoping for protection and prosperity. The hearth was sacred. It was where the fire burned, where food was cooked, where the family gathered. The goddess Vesta was the protector of the hearth. In the forum, there was a temple to Vesta, a round building where a sacred flame was kept burning at all times. If the flame went out, it was seen as a terrible omen. The flame was tended by priestesses called the Vestal Virgins. They were young women chosen from noble families who dedicated 30 years of their lives to serving Vesta. They lived in the temple, kept the flame burning, performed rituals, and were highly respected. The Romans also believed in spirits of place. Every spring, every grove, every crossroads had its own guardian spirit. These spirits were not gods in the grand sense, but they were real, present, deserving of acknowledgement. Travellers would leave small offerings at crossroads, asking for safe passage. Farmers would honour the spirits of their fields, hoping for good harvests. This world of gods and spirits might seem strange, but to the Romans it made perfect sense. The world was full of unseen powers. These powers could be benevolent or hostile, helpful or indifferent. The wise course was to treat them with respect, to honour them, to try to stay on their good side. Life in early Rome revolved around agriculture. Most people farmed. They grew wheat and barley, which they ground into flour and baked into bread or cooked into porridge. They grew vegetables, beans, lentils, onions, garlic, cabbage. They kept chickens for eggs, goats and sheep for milk and cheese. Some families had a pig, which might be fattened and slaughtered for a festival. Meat was not an everyday food. It was eaten on special occasions, at religious festivals, after sacrifices. The olive tree was important. Olives could be eaten, but more importantly, they were pressed to make oil. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for washing the body. It was valuable, a form of wealth. A family with a productive olive grove had security. Grapes were grown for wine. The Romans drank wine daily, but they rarely drank it pure. It was considered barbaric to drink undiluted wine. Instead, wine was mixed with water, usually more water than wine. This made it safer to drink, as the wine helped purify water that might otherwise carry disease. Wine was stored in large clay jars called amphorae. These jars were sealed with cork or clay and could be buried in the ground to keep cool. The agricultural year followed a predictable pattern. In autumn, after the heat of summer had passed and the first rains came, farmers ploughed their fields. Ploughs were simple, wooden tools pulled by oxen. The ploughman walked behind, guiding the plough, turning the soil. It was hard work, slow and tiring. Once the field was ploughed, seeds were scattered by hand, broadcast across the soil. Then the field was ploughed again lightly, to cover the seeds. Through the winter, the crops grew. Wheat and barley are winter crops. They sprout in the cool, wet months and mature in spring. Farmers watched their fields, pulled weeds, hoped for enough rain, but not too much. Too little rain, and the crops would wither. Too much, and they might rot or be washed away. In late spring or early summer, the grain was harvested. This was a time of intense labour. The grain had to be cut before it became overripe, and the seeds fell to the ground. Men and women worked together, using sickles to cut the stalks. The grain was tied into bundles and carried to a threshing floor, a flat area of hard-packed earth. There, it was beaten with flails or trampled by oxen to separate the grain from the chaff. Then it was winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind would blow away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain fell back down. The harvested grain was stored in large jars or in granaries, raised buildings designed to keep the grain dry and safe from rodents. This grain would feed the family through the year. If the harvest was good, there might be extra to sell or trade. If the harvest was poor, the family would go hungry. Olives were harvested in late autumn. The olives were beaten from the trees with long poles, collected in baskets, and taken to a press. The press was a heavy stone wheel that rolled over the olives, crushing them. The resulting paste was placed in woven baskets and pressed again, squeezing out the oil. The oil was collected in jars and stored. Grapes were harvested in autumn as well. They were picked by hand, placed in large vats, and crushed by foot. The juice flowed out and was collected in jars to ferment. Fermentation turned the sweet grape juice into wine. The process took weeks. The wine was then transferred to amphorae and sealed. Between the major tasks of planting and harvesting, there was always work to be done. Fences needed mending. Tools needed repairing. Animals needed tending. Weeds needed pulling. Firewood needed gathering. Children helped with these tasks from a young age. A 5-year-old might scatter feed for chickens. A 10-year-old might help weed a field or watch sheep. By their teenage years, children were doing the work of adults. Family life was structured and hierarchical. The oldest male, the paterfamilias, had authority over the household. This included his wife, his children, his unmarried daughters, his sons' wives and children if they lived with him, and any slaves the family owned. In theory, his power was absolute. In practice, it was tempered by custom, affection, and practical considerations. A wise paterfamilias consulted his wife, listened to his grown sons, and made decisions that benefited the whole family. Women managed the household. They supervised the preparation of food, the making of cloth, the care of children. Weaving was an important task. Wool from sheep was cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth on a loom. This cloth was made into tunics, cloaks, blankets. Store-bought cloth was expensive. Most families made their own. A Roman woman's life was largely private. She did not participate in politics, could not vote, could not hold office. But within the household she had authority and responsibility. She managed slaves, if the family had any. She made decisions about daily matters. She taught her daughters domestic skills, and her sons, when they were young, basic manners and morals. Marriage was arranged by families. It was an alliance between households, a way of creating connections, of ensuring the continuation of the family line. Love might develop between husband and wife, but it was not the primary reason for marriage. The purpose of marriage was to produce legitimate children, to maintain the family's property and name. A girl might be married in her early teens. A young man might marry in his 20s. The wedding was a public affair, with rituals and celebrations. The bride wore a special veil and was escorted from her father's house to her husband's house in a procession. There were prayers, sacrifices, a feast. The new couple would begin their life together, often in a room within the husband's father's house, if the father was still alive. Children were valued, but childhood was not a protected, carefree time. Infant mortality was high. Many children died before their first birthday, from disease, malnutrition, accidents. Those who survived faced a world where they were expected to contribute, to learn, to become useful members of the household as quickly as possible. Education for most children was informal. They learned by watching and imitating adults. A boy learned farming or a trade from his father. A girl learned household management from her mother. Reading and writing were not universal skills. They were useful for merchants, for officials, for the wealthy, but not necessary for a farmer or a labourer. In wealthy families, education was more formal. A boy might be taught by a tutor, a slave who was educated, often a Greek. He would learn to read and write Latin and Greek. He would study literature, history, mathematics, rhetoric. Rhetoric, the art of public speaking, was especially important. Success in Roman public life depended on the ability to persuade, to argue convincingly, to speak well in the Senate or in court. Girls from wealthy families might also be taught to read, though their education was less extensive. The focus was on preparing them to manage a household, to be good wives and mothers. Some women became highly educated, well-read, skilled in music or poetry, but these were exceptions. The Romans valued certain qualities above others. Gravitas, a seriousness of purpose, was admired. Pietas, a sense of duty to family, country, and gods, was essential. Virtues, courage and manliness, was important, especially for men. Dignitas, personal dignity and honor, mattered greatly. These values shaped behavior, influenced decisions, defined what it meant to be a good Roman. The city of Rome, even in its early days, was not isolated. It was part of a wider world. Traders came up the Tiber from Ostia, bringing goods from across the Mediterranean. Salt was harvested from pans near the coast and brought to Rome. This salt was valuable. It was used to preserve food, to add flavor. The road along which salt was transported was called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Neighboring cities and tribes were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. The Latins, the people who shared Rome's language and culture, were often allied with Rome. Together, they formed the Latin League, a confederation for mutual defense. But alliances were fragile. Disputes over land, water, honor could lead to conflict. Conflict, when it came, was usually small in scale. Two cities might fight over a disputed border, a stolen herd of cattle, an insult. The fighting was done by citizen soldiers, men who were farmers most of the year, but who took up arms when called. They fought with spears, swords, shields. Armor was expensive, so only the wealthier citizens had it. Battles were short, often decided in a single engagement. The victors might take some land, some livestock, and then return home. But the kingship did not last. According to Roman tradition, the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, whose name means Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant. He ruled harshly, ignoring the advice of the Senate, a council of elders. His son committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia. After this, the people of Rome rose up, drove out the king and his family, and decided never to be ruled by a king again. This happened, the Romans believed, in the year 509 before the Common Era. It marked the beginning of the Roman Republic. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, which means the public thing, or the commonwealth. The idea was that Rome now belonged to its people, or at least to its citizens, rather than to a single ruler. Power would be shared. The Romans created a system of government designed to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful. At the top were two consuls, elected each year. They held the highest authority, commanded the armies, presided over the Senate. But they served for only 1 year, and each could veto the other's decisions. After their year in office, they returned to private life. This was important. No man could hold on to power indefinitely. No man could become king. Below the consuls were other officials. Praetors administered justice, hearing legal cases and making rulings. Aediles managed the city's infrastructure, maintaining roads and public buildings, organizing festivals and games. Quaestors handled finances, managing the treasury, collecting taxes. All of these officials were elected, usually for 1 year. The system ensured that power circulated, that many men had a chance to serve, that no single individual could dominate. The Senate was a council made up of former magistrates, men who had held public office. Senators served for life. The Senate did not pass laws, but it advised the consuls and held enormous influence. It controlled finances, foreign policy, military matters. To be a senator was to be part of Rome's ruling class. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe, a mark of their status. They sat in the front rows at public games. They were addressed with respect. Their opinions carried weight. Then there were the assemblies, gatherings of Roman citizens who voted on laws and elected officials. There were different types of assemblies, organized in different ways. Some were organized by tribe, geographical divisions of Roman territory. Others were organized by century, groupings based on wealth and military equipment. The system was complex, and not every citizen had an equal voice. Wealthier citizens had more influence. But the idea that laws required the people's approval was important. It shaped Roman identity. Roman society was divided into different groups. At the top were the patricians, the old aristocratic families who traced their ancestry back to the earliest days of Rome. They held most of the power, most of the land, most of the wealth. Below them were the plebeians, the common people. Plebeians could be rich or poor, farmers or traders or craftsmen. For a long time, they were excluded from the highest offices and from the Senate. They could not marry patricians. They had fewer legal protections. Over time, the plebeians struggled for greater rights. This struggle, known as the conflict of the orders, lasted for about 200 years. It was mostly peaceful. The plebeians would threaten to leave Rome, to withdraw their labor and military service, and this threat gave them leverage. Gradually, they won concessions. They gained the right to elect their own officials, called tribunes, who could veto decisions that harmed plebeian interests. The tribunes were sacred, protected by religious law. To harm a tribune was an offense against the gods. This gave them power. A tribune could stand in the forum and say no, and that no had to be respected. They won the right to hold the consulship and other high offices. They gained legal protections. The laws of Rome were written down and displayed publicly, so that everyone could know them. These were called the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables were Rome's first written law code. Before this, laws had been passed down orally, interpreted by patrician priests who could change them to suit their interests. The plebeians demanded that the laws be written and made public. A commission was appointed, and they travelled to Greece to study Greek law codes. When they returned, they drafted 12 bronze tablets inscribed with laws covering property, family relations, legal procedures, and crimes. These tablets were set up in the forum where everyone could see them. The laws were simple and direct. They covered practical matters. If a man's tree branches overhung a neighbour's land, the neighbour could cut them. If a man broke another man's bone, the penalty was retaliation in kind, unless they agreed on compensation. If someone was summoned to court and refused to come, witnesses could seize him and bring him by force. The laws were not always fair by modern standards, but they were public. Everyone knew what they were. This was progress. It meant that patricians could not simply invent laws to suit themselves. It meant that plebeians had a basis for demanding justice. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, the distinction between patricians and plebeians mattered less. A new aristocracy had emerged, made up of both patrician and wealthy plebeian families. These families formed the ruling class, the nobility. They competed with one another for office and glory, but they also cooperated to maintain their collective power. Competition among the nobility was intense but regulated. Families sought honour, prestige, influence. They displayed the death masks of their ancestors in their homes, reminding visitors of their lineage, their history of service. At funerals, these masks were worn by actors who processed through the streets, representing the family's illustrious dead. It was a way of asserting status, of claiming a place in Rome's story. A young nobleman began his career by serving in the army. Military service was expected, a duty and an opportunity. After serving, he might stand for election to a minor office, perhaps as a quaestor. If successful, he would serve his year, then seek higher office. Step by step, he would climb what was called the cursus honorum, the course of honours. Each office brought responsibilities, opportunities to prove oneself, to build a reputation, to make connections. At the top was the consulship. To be consul was the pinnacle of a political career. A man's name would be recorded in the official lists. The year would be known by the names of its consuls. After serving as consul, a man might be given command of an army, governorship of a province, further opportunities for glory and wealth. Or he might retire, content with having reached the highest office, spending his remaining years as an elder statesman, advising younger men, enjoying the respect due to a former consul. But not everyone could reach the consulship. There were only 2 consuls each year and many ambitious men. Competition was fierce, elections were hard fought. Candidates courted voters, made promises, distributed favours. Bribery was common, though officially illegal. A man might hire agents to work the crowds, spreading his name, praising his virtues, attacking his rivals. Voters expected benefits from their support. They might expect money or jobs or help with legal troubles. The common people, the ordinary citizens, had their own concerns. They wanted fair treatment under the law. They wanted affordable grain. They wanted their voices heard. The tribunes, elected by the plebeian assembly, represented these interests. A good tribune could protect the poor from exploitation, could veto unjust laws, could prosecute corrupt officials. A bad tribune might be bought by the wealthy, might betray the people he was supposed to represent. Public life in the Republic was lived in the open. The forum was where politics happened. Men gathered there to talk, to argue, to hear speeches. Elections were held there, or in nearby open spaces. Trials were held there, with crowds watching, cheering or jeering. There was no separation between public and private in the way we might understand it. A politician's life was on display. His words and actions were observed, judged, remembered. Oratory, the art of public speaking, was essential. A man who could speak well, who could move a crowd with his words, had power. Young men studied rhetoric, learning techniques of persuasion, practicing speeches, memorizing examples from the past. They learned to speak with confidence, with emotion, with logic. They learned how to structure an argument, how to appeal to an audience's sense of justice, how to discredit an opponent. Trials were theatrical. A prosecutor would accuse someone of a crime, often corruption, embezzlement, or treason. The accused would defend himself or hire an advocate to speak for him. Both sides would make speeches, calling witnesses, presenting evidence, appealing to the jury. The jury was large, sometimes hundreds of citizens, chosen by lot. They would listen to the speeches, then vote, using tokens dropped into urns. A majority decided the verdict. Punishments for serious crimes could be harsh. A citizen could be exiled, losing his property and his rights. In extreme cases, he could be executed, though Roman citizens had the right to appeal to the people, and execution of a citizen was rare. Non-citizens and slaves had no such protections. They could be beaten, tortured, crucified. Daily life for most Romans was simpler and quieter than the drama of the Forum. Most people did not hold office, did not make speeches, did not attend trials. They worked, raised families, observed religious festivals, and tried to get by. Housing varied greatly depending on wealth. The rich lived in large houses called domus. These houses were built around a central courtyard called an atrium. The atrium was open to the sky, with a pool in the centre to catch rainwater. Rooms opened off the atrium, bedrooms, dining rooms, storage rooms. At the back was often a garden with plants, fountains, statues. The houses were decorated with frescoes, paintings on the walls, and mosaics, pictures made from tiny tiles of coloured stone. These houses were private spaces, but also semi-public. The front rooms were used to receive clients, people of lower status who depended on the wealthy man for favours, protection, or support. Each morning, clients would come to their patron's house, greeting him, offering their services, receiving small gifts of money or food. This was the patron-client relationship, a fundamental part of Roman society. The patron provided support and protection. The client provided loyalty, service, and political backing. Most people, however, did not live in spacious houses. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae. These were multi-story structures built from wood and brick, often poorly constructed. The ground floor might have shops or workshops opening onto the street. Above were apartments, reached by narrow stairs. The higher up you lived, the cheaper the rent and the worse the conditions. Upper floors were cramped, dark, prone to fire, and had no running water. Water was carried up from public fountains. Waste was carried down and dumped in the streets or in pits. The smell in the crowded neighborhoods could be overwhelming. Streets were narrow, often blocked by carts and vendors. Noise was constant, the shouts of merchants, the clatter of wheels, the hammering of craftsmen, the cries of children. Despite the crowding and the noise, there were public amenities that improved life. Rome had public baths, open to all for a small fee. The baths were more than just places to wash. They were social centres, places to relax, to exercise, to meet friends. A typical bath complex had several rooms. There was a cold room, the frigidarium, with a cold plunge pool. There was a warm room, the tepidarium. And there was a hot room, the caldarium, heated by an underground furnace. Bathers would move from room to room, sweating in the heat, then cooling off in the cold pool. The baths were large and beautifully decorated. They had high ceilings, marble floors, painted walls. Some had exercise areas, libraries, gardens. People would spend hours there, bathing, talking, exercising, reading. Men and women bathed at different times or in separate sections. Public games and festivals provided entertainment. The most popular were the chariot races, held in the Circus Maximus, a huge stadium that could hold more than 100,000 spectators. The races were thrilling. Chariots pulled by 4 horses raced around a track 7 laps, drivers risking their lives for glory and prize money. Crashes were common. Drivers could be thrown from their chariots, trampled, dragged. The crowd loved it. There were factions, teams identified by colours: red, white, blue, green. Spectators supported their faction passionately, betting on races, celebrating victories, mourning defeats. Successful charioteers became celebrities, famous and wealthy. Some were slaves who won their freedom through racing. Others were free men who chose the dangerous profession for the rewards it offered. Gladiatorial games were another form of entertainment. Gladiators were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals trained to fight in arenas. They fought each other or wild animals. The fights were bloody, often fatal, but they were also skilled displays of combat. Gladiators trained in schools, learning different fighting styles, using different weapons. Some became famous, admired for their courage and skill. The games were expensive to stage, so they were sponsored by wealthy individuals or by the state. A sponsor who put on impressive games would win popularity, which could translate into political support. The crowd's favour mattered. At the end of a fight, if a gladiator was defeated but had fought bravely, the crowd might call for his life to be spared. The sponsor, or the emperor if he was present, would decide, sometimes following the crowd's wishes, sometimes not. Theatrical performances were also popular, though less so than races and gladiatorial combat. Plays were performed in temporary wooden theatres, later in stone ones. Comedies were favourite, especially the works of playwrights like Plautus and Terence, who adapted Greek comedies for Roman audiences. The plots involved mistaken identities, clever slaves, young lovers, grumpy old men. They were funny, bawdy, entertaining. Actors were usually slaves or freedmen of low social status. Acting was not considered a respectable profession for a citizen, yet popular actors could become wealthy and famous. They wore masks to indicate their characters, exaggerated their gestures so the audience in the back rows could see, shouted their lines to be heard. Religious festivals filled the calendar. There were more than 100 official festival days each year. Some were solemn, marked by sacrifices and prayers. Others were joyful, with feasting, music, and dancing. The Saturnalia, held in December, was a time of celebration and role reversal. Slaves were given temporary freedom, allowed to speak freely, even to insult their masters. Gifts were exchanged. People feasted and drank. It was a release from the normal order, a time of license and joy. The Lupercalia, held in February, was an ancient fertility festival. Young men, nearly naked, ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goatskin. Women believed that being struck would make them fertile. The festival was chaotic, exuberant, rooted in traditions far older than the Republic. Religion, as mentioned, was woven into everything. Temples stood throughout the city. Priests performed rituals, made sacrifices, interpreted omens. The gods were many, and each had their own sphere. Mars was the god of war. Venus was the goddess of love. Mercury was the god of trade and travel. Ceres was the goddess of grain. Romans prayed to the gods, made offerings, sought their favor. Sacrifices were the main form of worship. An animal, usually a sheep, a pig, or an ox, would be brought to the temple. Prayers would be spoken. The animal would be killed, its blood offered to the god. The meat would be cooked and distributed, some burned for the god, some eaten by the priests, some given to the people. A sacrifice was both a religious act and a communal meal. Omens were taken seriously. Before any important decision, the gods were consulted. Priests called augurs would observe the flight of birds, looking for signs. If the birds flew in the right direction, the omens were good. If not, the decision might be postponed. Other priests, called haruspices, examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, looking for abnormalities that might indicate the god's will. This might seem superstitious, but to the Romans, it was practical. The gods were real, powerful, involved in human affairs. Ignoring them was foolish and dangerous. Better to take the time to consult them, to make sure they approved, than to risk their anger. The expansion of Rome beyond the city and its immediate surroundings happened gradually. Rome fought wars with neighboring peoples, the Sabines, the Aequi, the Volsci. These wars were seasonal. Armies were raised in the spring, campaigned through the summer, and disbanded in the autumn so men could return to their farms for the harvest. The Roman army at this time was a citizen militia. Every male citizen who owned property was liable for military service. They provided their own equipment. The wealthiest served as cavalry, riding horses into battle. Those of moderate wealth served as heavy infantry, wearing armor, carrying large shields, fighting in tight formations. The poorest served as light infantry with minimal equipment, throwing javelins, skirmishing. The basic unit of the Roman army was the legion. A legion consisted of about 4,000 to 5,000 men, divided into smaller units called manipules. The manipules were arranged in 3 lines. The front line was made up of younger men. The second line was more experienced. The third line, the triarii, were veterans, held in reserve. This arrangement allowed flexibility. If the front line faltered, the second line could move forward. If both were pressed, the triarii would advance. Roman soldiers trained regularly, practiced formations, learned to obey commands instantly. Discipline was strict. Cowardice was punished harshly. A soldier who fled from battle could be executed. An entire unit that broke and ran might be decimated. Every 10th man selected by lot and killed by his comrades. This severity ensured that soldiers fought, even in desperate situations. But the army also rewarded courage. A soldier who performed bravely might receive decorations, praise, promotion. Generals distributed loot after victories, enriching their soldiers. Veterans were given land, a farm of their own, security in their old age. Military service was hard and dangerous, but it offered opportunities for poor men to improve their lives. Rome's wars with its neighbors were usually successful. Roman armies were well-trained, disciplined, persistent. When Rome lost a battle, and it sometimes did, it would raise a new army and fight again. Rome did not give up. This persistence wore down its enemies. Eventually, most of the Latin cities, the Etruscans, the Sabines, the Volsci, all came under Roman control. Rome's method of dealing with conquered peoples varied. Some were made full citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Others were made allies, required to provide troops to Rome but allowed to govern themselves. Still, others were made subjects, paying tribute, obeying Roman commands, but with limited rights. This flexibility was one of Rome's strengths. It could adapt, could offer different arrangements to different peoples, could bind them to Rome in different ways. The Latin League, the confederation of Latin cities, was absorbed into the Roman state. The Latins were given citizenship or allied status. They fought alongside Romans, shared in victories, became part of Rome's growing power. The boundary between Roman and Latin blurred, then disappeared. Further south, Rome came into conflict with the Samnites, a tough mountain people who controlled much of central Italy. The Samnite wars lasted on and off for decades. They were hard fought, with victories and defeats on both sides. The Samnites were skilled fighters, using the rough terrain to their advantage. Roman armies struggled in the mountains, where their usual tactics were less effective. But Rome learned, adapted, persisted. Eventually, the Samnites were defeated, their territory taken, their people incorporated into the Roman system. Some became allies, some subjects, some slaves. The wars left deep scars, memories of bitterness and loss, but Rome emerged stronger. Its territory expanded, its army experienced and confident. In the south, the Greek cities watched Rome's expansion with concern. These cities were wealthy, cultured, proud of their Greek heritage. They had their own armies, their own alliances. Some sought help from Greece itself, inviting Greek generals and mercenaries to defend them. One such general was Pyrrhus, a king from the region called Epirus. Pyrrhus brought an army, including war elephants, to fight the Romans. Pyrrhus won battles, but at great cost. His victories were so costly in lives and resources that they gained nothing. From this comes the term Pyrrhic victory, a win that is not worth the price. Eventually, Pyrrhus gave up and returned to Greece. The Greek cities of southern Italy fell one by one to Rome. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. It was no longer a city-state. It was a regional power, with hundreds of thousands of citizens, millions of allies and subjects, an army that could field dozens of legions. It had wealth from the fertile lands it controlled, manpower from the peoples it had conquered or allied with, and confidence from its long string of victories. But expansion brought challenges. As Rome's territory grew, so did the complexity of governing it. The Senate and the magistrates had to manage distant territories, deal with diverse peoples, allocate resources, settle disputes. The old system of annual magistrates worked well for a city-state, but was strained by the demands of a growing empire. Generals commanding armies far from Rome gained power and independence. They made decisions in the field, negotiated treaties, distributed loot. They became popular with their soldiers, who looked to them for rewards. The bond between general and soldier began to rival the bond between citizen and state. This would have consequences in the centuries to come. Rome's expansion also brought it into contact with other major powers. To the west, across the sea, lay the city of Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy trading empire, founded by Phoenician colonists from the eastern Mediterranean. It controlled the coast of North Africa, parts of Spain, the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Its navy was the strongest in the Mediterranean. Its merchants traded across the known world, bringing in gold, silver, ivory, spices, slaves. Rome and Carthage had been on friendly terms, even signing treaties that defined their spheres of influence. But as Rome expanded into southern Italy and Carthage sought to control Sicily, their interests collided. The result was a series of wars, known as the Punic Wars, that would last more than a century and reshape the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War began in 264 before the Common Era. It was fought mainly over Sicily. A group of mercenaries had seized the city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily. They appealed to both Rome and Carthage for help. Rome decided to intervene. This brought Roman and Carthaginian forces into direct conflict. The war lasted for more than 20 years. Much of it was fought at sea. Rome had little naval experience, but the Romans were practical people. They captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, studied its design, and built their own fleet, copying the enemy's ships. Roman sailors were inexperienced, so Roman engineers invented a boarding bridge called a corvus, a raven. This bridge had a spike on the end. When a Roman ship came alongside an enemy ship, the bridge would drop, the spike would embed in the enemy deck, and Roman soldiers would rush across and fight hand to hand. This turned naval battles into land battles, where Roman infantry excelled. The war was costly for both sides. Fleets were built, destroyed in storms, rebuilt. Armies marched across Sicily, besieged cities, fought in the hills and plains. Gradually, Rome gained the upper hand. Carthage, exhausted, sued for peace. The treaty required Carthage to evacuate Sicily, to pay a large indemnity, and to give up its other Mediterranean islands. Sicily became Rome's first province, a territory outside Italy governed directly by Roman officials. A province was different from an allied territory. It was ruled, not partnered with. A Roman governor, usually a former consul or praetor, would be sent to administer it. He had broad powers, military and civilian. He collected taxes, maintained order, dispensed justice. Some governors were fair and competent, others were corrupt, extracting wealth for themselves, exploiting the local population. There was little oversight. A governor far from Rome, with an army at his command, could act almost as a king. The wealth that flowed from the provinces enriched Rome. Tax revenues increased. Grain from Sicily fed the growing population of the city. Silver from Spanish mines filled the treasury. Slaves captured in war or bought in markets provided labor. The economy grew, but so did inequality. The rich became richer. The poor, especially small farmers, struggled. Between the First and Second Punic Wars, Rome continued to expand. It fought wars in northern Italy, in Illyria across the Adriatic, in Sardinia and Corsica. Roman power grew. Carthage, humiliated by its defeat, sought to rebuild. It turned its attention to Spain, a land rich in silver and other resources. A Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca led the expansion. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, and then by his son, Hannibal. Hannibal was a brilliant and determined commander. He had grown up hating Rome. According to legend, his father made him swear an oath as a child to be Rome's enemy forever. When Hannibal came of age and took command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain, he prepared for war. The Second Punic War began in 218 before the Common Era. Hannibal decided on a bold strategy. Instead of waiting for Rome to attack Carthage, he would take the war to Italy. He assembled an army, including war elephants, and marched from Spain through southern Gaul and across the Alps into Italy. The crossing of the Alps was an extraordinary feat. The passes were narrow, steep, treacherous. Snow and ice covered the heights. Local tribes attacked the column. Many men and animals died. But Hannibal persevered. He emerged into the plains of northern Italy with an army, smaller than when he started, but intact and ready to fight. For the next 15 years, Hannibal campaigned in Italy. He won battles, defeating Roman armies again and again. He used clever tactics, ambushes, encirclements. He was a master of using terrain, of reading his enemy's intentions, of striking at the right moment. Roman generals who faced him often underestimated him and paid the price. But Hannibal could not take Rome itself. Rome's walls were strong, its defences formidable. And Rome would not surrender. After each defeat, the Senate raised new armies, called up more men, and sent them to fight. The Romans changed their strategy, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal, harassing his supply lines, attacking his allies. One Roman general, Fabius, became known as the delayer because he refused to engage Hannibal directly, instead wearing him down through attrition. Meanwhile, Roman armies struck at Carthage's allies and possessions. They invaded Spain, cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements and supplies. They allied with local tribes, turning Carthage's subjects against it. Slowly, the tide turned. A young Roman general named Scipio emerged as a brilliant commander. He defeated the Carthaginian forces in Spain, then invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his homeland. The two generals met at the Battle of Zama in 202, before the Common Era. Scipio won. Hannibal was defeated for the first time in his career. Carthage surrendered. The peace terms were harsh. Carthage had to give up its navy, its overseas territories, its elephants. It had to pay a huge indemnity over 50 years. It was forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission. Carthage, once a great power, was reduced to a subject state. Rome emerged from the war as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. But the war had taken a toll. Italy had been ravaged, farms had been destroyed, livestock stolen, villages burned. Many small farmers had lost their land, either to the war's devastation or to debt. They drifted to the cities, especially Rome, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. The rich, meanwhile, bought up the abandoned land, creating large estates worked by slaves. These estates, called latifundia, became the dominant form of agriculture. They were efficient, producing grain, oil, and wine for export, but they displaced the small farmers who had been the backbone of Roman society. After the Second Punic War, Rome turned its attention eastward, to the Greek world. The eastern Mediterranean was dominated by several large kingdoms, the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. These kingdoms, ruled by Greek dynasties, were wealthy, cultured, powerful. They fought wars with each other, made alliances, engaged in diplomacy. Rome was drawn into these conflicts, sometimes as an ally, sometimes as an arbiter, sometimes as a conqueror. The process was gradual. Rome did not set out to conquer the East. It happened step by step, war by war, treaty by treaty. The kingdom of Macedon in northern Greece was seen as a threat. Rome fought several wars with Macedon, eventually defeating it and making it a Roman province. Greece itself, a land of independent city-states, came under Roman influence. The cities retained their autonomy, their own governments, but they were expected to follow Rome's lead. When some Greek cities resisted, Rome intervened, sometimes harshly. The city of Corinth, which led a revolt, was destroyed, its population enslaved as a warning to others. In the east, the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor states to Alexander's empire, controlled a vast territory stretching from Asia Minor to Persia. Rome fought a war with the Seleucids, defeating them and imposing terms. The Seleucid king had to abandon his territories in Asia Minor, pay an indemnity, and surrender his war elephants and his navy. Another Greek kingdom, Pergamum in Western Asia Minor, allied with Rome. When the last king of Pergamum died without an heir, he left his kingdom to Rome in his will. Rome accepted, turning it into the province of Asia. This was an extraordinarily wealthy region, and its revenues enriched Rome enormously. Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, remained independent for now, ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were cautious, maintaining good relations with Rome, paying tribute, avoiding conflict. Egypt was fabulously wealthy, its grain essential to feeding Rome's growing population. Rome was content to leave Egypt independent as long as it remained cooperative. The conquest of the Greek East brought immense wealth to Rome, but it also brought change. Roman soldiers and officials returned from the East with new tastes, new ideas, new habits. They had seen the splendor of Greek cities, the sophistication of Greek culture, the luxury of Eastern courts. They brought back Greek art, Greek books, Greek teachers. Greek culture began to permeate Roman society. Wealthy Romans learned Greek, read Greek literature, studied Greek philosophy. Greek tutors were hired to educate Roman children. Greek doctors, Greek architects, Greek artists came to Rome and found patrons. The Greek language became the language of the educated, a mark of culture and refinement. Not everyone approved. Some Romans, especially older, more conservative men, worried that Greek culture was corrupting Roman virtue. They saw Greek habits, luxury, the love of pleasure and ease, as weakening Rome's traditional values of discipline, simplicity, and duty. One such man was Cato the Elder, a senator who railed against Greek influence, who spoke in the Senate wearing a simple toga, who lived plainly and disdained luxury. But the tide could not be turned. Rome was changing, becoming cosmopolitan, cultured, sophisticated. It was no longer just an Italian city-state. It was the capital of an empire, a place where peoples and cultures from across the Mediterranean met and mixed. The Third Punic War was brief and brutal. Carthage, though weakened, had begun to recover economically. Some in Rome, especially Cato the Elder, saw this as a threat. Cato famously ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." Eventually, Rome found a pretext for war. Carthage had defended itself against a neighboring kingdom without Rome's permission, violating the peace treaty. Rome demanded that Carthage surrender, disarm, and relocate inland, away from the sea. The Carthaginians refused. They fortified their city and prepared to resist. Rome besieged Carthage. The siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and cut off. Finally, Roman forces breached the walls. The city was taken, street by street, house by house. The population was killed or enslaved. The city was burned. According to tradition, though this may not be true, the Romans ploughed the site with salt so that nothing would grow there. Carthage was erased. The destruction of Carthage marked a turning point. Rome was now the unchallenged master of the Mediterranean. There was no power that could oppose it. The sea, Mare Nostrum, was Rome's. Trade flowed freely. Grain ships from Egypt, oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, slaves from everywhere, all moved along Roman-controlled routes, enriching Rome and its allies. But Rome itself was troubled. The wealth from conquest was not evenly distributed. The aristocracy grew fabulously rich. Senators and equestrians, the wealthy class just below the senators, owned vast estates, engaged in trade, lent money at interest. They built palatial homes, filled them with Greek art, hosted lavish banquets. The poor, meanwhile, struggled. Small farmers, the traditional backbone of the Republic, were disappearing. Their land had been bought up or seized. Many had moved to Rome, where they lived in crowded tenements, survived on handouts of grain, and looked for work as day labourers. They were citizens with the right to vote, but they had little real power or security. The gap between rich and poor was widening, and this created tension. Some members of the aristocracy, sensing danger, tried to address the problem. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, both tribunes, proposed reforms. They wanted to redistribute public land to the poor, to limit the size of estates, to provide land for veterans. These were reasonable proposals, aimed at restoring the class of small farmers and reducing inequality. But the proposals threatened the interests of the wealthy, who had been using public land as if it were their own. The Senate and the conservative faction opposed the Gracchi. Political conflict turned violent. Tiberius Gracchus was killed by a mob of senators and their supporters. His brother Gaius, a few years later, met the same fate. Their deaths marked the beginning of a period of political violence that would eventually destroy the Republic. The army was changing as well. The old system of a citizen militia was breaking down. Campaigns were lasting longer, taking soldiers far from home for years at a time. Small farmers could not afford to be away so long. Their farms would fail. So military service increasingly fell to the poor, landless men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. A general named Marius reformed the army. He opened recruitment to all citizens, not just property owners. He offered pay, equipment, and the promise of land upon discharge. Soldiers became professional, serving for many years, loyal to their general who provided for them. This created effective, experienced legions, but it also shifted loyalty. Soldiers looked to their general, not to the Senate or the state. Generals who commanded armies for years, who won victories and distributed loot, became powerful, semi-independent figures. Marius himself was a prime example. He was a capable general, elected consul multiple times, a populist who championed the common people against the aristocracy. He defeated invasions of Germanic tribes that threatened Italy, saving Rome from danger. But he also used his armies to pursue his political goals, setting a precedent that others would follow. Another powerful general, Sulla, emerged as Marius's rival. Sulla was a conservative, a supporter of the Senate and the aristocracy. The conflict between Marius and Sulla became a civil war, the first of many. Armies loyal to each general fought each other in Italy. Cities were besieged, populations massacred, property confiscated. Sulla eventually won. He marched on Rome with his army, something that had never been done before, and made himself dictator. As dictator, Sulla tried to restore the power of the Senate, to roll back the reforms that had empowered the common people and the tribunes. He proscribed his enemies, posting lists of names of men to be killed, their property confiscated. Thousands died. Terror gripped Rome. But Sulla, having imposed his will, retired. He gave up the dictatorship, returned to private life, and died soon after. His retirement was surprising. He had absolute power and gave it up. But the damage was done. The precedent had been set. A general with an army could march on Rome, could seize power, could reshape the state. The Republic's institutions, designed to prevent tyranny, had been shown to be fragile. In the decades that followed, Rome continued to expand. New provinces were added in Gaul, in Asia Minor, in the East. Generals like Pompey campaigned across the Mediterranean, defeating pirates, conquering kingdoms, settling disputes. Pompey became immensely powerful and popular. He celebrated 3 triumphs, grand parades through Rome displaying the spoils of his victories. He built a massive theatre, the first permanent stone theatre in Rome, a gift to the people that bore his name. But Pompey was not alone. Other ambitious men sought power and glory. One of them was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar came from an old patrician family, but not a particularly wealthy or influential one. He was ambitious, intelligent, charismatic. He climbed the political ladder, made alliances, borrowed heavily to fund public games and win popular support. Caesar formed an alliance with Pompey and another wealthy and powerful man, Crassus. This alliance, sometimes called the First Triumvirate, dominated Roman politics. They cooperated to achieve their individual goals, using their wealth, influence, and popularity to control elections, to pass laws, to block their enemies. Caesar was given command of the provinces of Gaul, the region we now call France and Belgium. At the time, Gaul was partly under Roman control, but much of it was still independent, inhabited by Celtic tribes who were fierce and warlike. Caesar spent 9 years in Gaul, leading his legions in a series of campaigns that brought the entire region under Roman control. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were methodical and relentless. He fought battles, besieged fortified towns, crossed rivers, marched through forests. He dealt with tribal coalitions, with rebellions, with invasions from across the Rhine. He even crossed to Britain twice, though he did not conquer it. His campaigns were recorded in his own writings, the commentaries on the Gallic War, a clear, straightforward account, written in the third person. The Gallic Wars made Caesar wealthy and famous. His soldiers were loyal to him, enriched by loot, rewarded with land. His reputation in Rome grew, but the alliance with Pompey and Crassus was fraying. Crassus died, killed in a disastrous campaign in the east. Pompey, jealous of Caesar's success, aligned with the Senate, which feared Caesar's power. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that if he did so, his enemies would prosecute him, strip him of his wealth and status, possibly exile or kill him. He faced a choice: obey and lose everything, or defy the Senate and march on Rome. In January of 49 before the Common Era, Caesar made his decision. He crossed the Rubicon, a small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy. To cross with an army was an act of war. Caesar is said to have remarked as he crossed, "The die is cast." There was no turning back. Civil war followed. Caesar moved quickly, marching down Italy. Many cities opened their gates to him. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, taking their forces with them. Caesar pursued. He fought campaigns in Spain, in Greece, in Egypt, in North Africa, defeating Pompey's forces wherever he found them. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was killed by the Egyptian king, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. In Egypt, Caesar became involved in a civil war between the young king and his sister, Cleopatra. Caesar sided with Cleopatra, helped her take the throne, and became her lover. He stayed in Egypt for several months, a dangerous delay, but eventually he returned to Rome. Caesar's victories in the civil war left him the undisputed master of Rome. He held the office of dictator, not for a limited time as tradition dictated, but continuously. He enacted reforms, reorganized the calendar, settled veterans on land, began large building projects. He pardoned many of his former enemies, a gesture of clemency that he hoped would reconcile them. But some were not reconciled. They believed that Caesar intended to make himself king, to end the republic and rule as a monarch. A group of senators, led by men named Brutus and Cassius, conspired to kill him. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era, they stabbed him to death in the Senate house. Caesar died at the foot of a statue of Pompey, his former friend and rival. The assassination did not save the Republic. It plunged Rome into another civil war, even more destructive than the last. Caesar's supporters, led by his lieutenant Mark Antony and his adopted heir, a young man named Octavian, hunted down the assassins and defeated them. Then, Antony and Octavian turned on each other. The final conflict played out over more than a decade. Antony went east, allied with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Together they controlled the eastern provinces, rich and populous. Octavian controlled the west, including Italy. The two sides prepared for war. The decisive moment came in 31 before the Common Era at the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his capable general Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Octavian pursued. Trapped, with no hope of escape, Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide. Egypt became a Roman province, the personal possession of Octavian. Octavian returned to Rome as the sole ruler of the Roman world. He was only 32 years old. He had fought in civil wars for more than a decade. He had seen the Republic tear itself apart. He knew that the old system was broken, that something new was needed. But he also knew that Romans hated the idea of kingship, that any attempt to crown himself would lead to his assassination, as it had with Caesar. So Octavian was careful. He claimed to restore the Republic. He gave back power to the Senate, or so he said. In reality, he kept control of the army, the provinces, the treasury. He held various titles and offices, carefully accumulated, that gave him authority without making him seem like a king. He was called princeps, first citizen. He was granted the name Augustus, which means revered or majestic. He was given tribunician power, which made his person sacred and gave him the ability to veto. He was the commander of the armies, the chief priest, the father of the country. Augustus, as Octavian was now called, ruled for more than 40 years, from 27 before the Common Era until his death in the year 14 of the Common Era. His reign brought stability after decades of war. The civil wars ended. The frontiers were secured. Trade flourished. The population grew. Cities were rebuilt, beautified, expanded. Augustus was a careful ruler. He worked with the Senate, or appeared to. He presented himself as a servant of the state, not a master. He lived modestly, or at least claimed to, avoiding ostentatious displays of wealth. He wore simple togas, ate plain food, and encouraged traditional Roman virtues. He passed laws promoting marriage and childbearing, trying to reverse the decline in the birth rate among citizens. He patronized poets and artists who celebrated Rome and his own achievements. The poets Virgil, Horace, and Ovid all lived during Augustus's reign. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic poem that told the story of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who founded the Roman people. The poem linked Rome to the ancient world of Troy, to the gods, to a grand destiny. It was propaganda, certainly, but it was also beautiful, moving, a masterpiece of Latin literature. Horace wrote odes and satires, poems about love, friendship, the pleasures of life, and the duties of citizenship. Ovid wrote about mythology, about love, about transformation. His Metamorphoses retold Greek and Roman myths in flowing Latin verse. These works shaped how Romans thought about themselves, about their history, about their place in the world. Augustus also transformed the city of Rome itself. He claimed that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was an exaggeration, but it captured something true. Augustus and his supporters built temples, basilicas, forums, theatres, baths. The Forum of Augustus was a grand public space, surrounded by colonnades, with a temple to Mars at one end. The Arapaces, the altar of peace, was a beautiful monument covered in relief sculptures, showing processions, sacrifices, and allegories of peace and prosperity. The population of Rome grew to perhaps 1 million people. It was by far the largest city in the empire, a teeming, crowded, noisy place. People from all over the Mediterranean came to Rome, seeking work, opportunity, a new life. Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Jews, Gauls, Spaniards all lived side by side in the city's neighborhoods. Feeding this population was a constant challenge. Rome itself produced almost no food. Everything had to be imported. Grain came from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily. Olive oil came from Spain. Wine came from Gaul and Italy. The grain supply was critical. If it failed, people would starve, and riots would follow. Augustus and his successors devoted enormous resources to ensuring a steady supply. A grain dole was provided to citizens, a free ration of wheat each month. This kept the poor fed and the city stable. The distribution of grain was organized through a complex bureaucracy. Officials kept lists of citizens entitled to the dole. Grain was stored in massive warehouses near the Tiber. On distribution days, citizens would queue to receive their allotment. The system was not perfect. There was fraud, inefficiency, crowding. But it worked, more or less, and it prevented famine. Water was another essential resource. Rome's population needed vast amounts of fresh water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and washing. This was supplied by aqueducts, long channels that brought water from springs and rivers in the hills outside the city. The aqueducts were marvels of engineering. They ran for miles, mostly underground or at ground level. But in places where they crossed valleys, they were carried on great arches of stone. The water flowed by gravity, following a gentle downward slope. The gradient had to be precise. Too steep, and the water would flow too fast, eroding the channel. Too shallow, and it would stagnate. Roman engineers calculated the gradients carefully, surveyed the land, built the channels with extraordinary precision. Water arrived in Rome at distribution points, where it flowed into pipes and was directed to public fountains, baths, and wealthy households. The fountains were the main source of water for ordinary people. They stood on street corners, supplied constantly by the aqueducts. People would come with jugs and buckets to fill them, carrying water back to their homes. Wealthy households had piped water, a luxury. The pipes were made of lead or clay. Water flowed into the house, filling cisterns and feeding fountains in the courtyards. Having running water in your home was a sign of status, of wealth, of connection to power. The baths, as mentioned earlier, were important social institutions. They were supplied with enormous amounts of water, which was heated for the hot rooms. The heating system was ingenious. Fires burned in furnaces beneath the floors. The hot air and smoke passed through spaces under the floor and up through cavities in the walls, heating the rooms from below and from the sides. This system, called a hypocaust, was efficient and effective. Rome was a city of contrasts. Grand public buildings stood alongside cramped slums. Marble temples overlooked narrow, filthy streets. The wealthy lived in spacious houses with gardens and fountains. The poor lived in overcrowded tenements, several families to a room, with no sanitation, no light, no privacy. Fire was a constant danger. The tenements were built largely of wood. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and carelessness could easily start a blaze. Once started, fire spread quickly in the crowded buildings. There was no organized fire brigade for much of Rome's history. People formed bucket chains, trying to douse the flames with water from fountains. But often the best they could do was to pull down buildings in the fire's path to create a fire break. Augustus created a fire brigade, the Vigiles, units of men who patrolled the streets at night, watched for fires, and fought them when they broke out. The Vigiles also acted as a night watch, maintaining order, arresting criminals, and dealing with disturbances. Their presence made the city safer, but fire remained a serious threat. Crime was another problem. Rome was a city of many poor, desperate people. Theft was common. Muggings happened, especially at night in unlit streets. Organized gangs controlled some neighborhoods, extorting protection money, running illegal businesses. The wealthy hired bodyguards, slaves or freedmen who accompanied them when they went out. They avoided dangerous areas, stayed home after dark. Despite these problems, Rome was also a city of opportunity and spectacle. The games, the races, the theatrical performances provided entertainment and distraction. The public buildings, the temples, the forums were open to all. A poor citizen could walk the same streets as a senator, could stand in the forum where great men gave speeches, could feel himself part of something grand. The empire that Augustus ruled stretched from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the deserts of North Africa in the south. It encompassed diverse landscapes, climates, peoples, and cultures. In the west, Spain was a wealthy province, rich in metals, especially silver, copper, and gold. Mines in Spain produced vast quantities of these metals, enriching Rome. Spanish olive oil and wine were exported across the empire. Cities like Tarraco and Cordoba were centers of Roman culture, with temples, theaters, and forums built in the Roman style. Gaul, the region of modern France and Belgium, had been recently conquered by Julius Caesar. It was a land of forests, rivers, and fertile plains. The Gallic tribes, once fierce and independent, had been subdued and were gradually adopting Roman ways. Roman veterans were settled in colonies, new towns built in strategic locations. Roads were constructed, connecting Gaul to Italy and to the Rhine frontier. The Rhine was the northern boundary of the empire in the west. Beyond the Rhine lived Germanic tribes, people the Romans called barbarians. The Romans built forts along the Rhine, manned by legions. These forts were not just military bases. They grew into towns with markets, workshops, temples. Soldiers served on the frontier for 25 years, and many settled nearby when they retired, marrying local women, raising families, blending Roman and local cultures. Britain, the island across the sea from Gaul, was partially conquered during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, a few decades after Augustus. The southern part of Britain became a Roman province. The northern part, inhabited by fierce tribes, remained independent. A wall, Hadrian's Wall, was later built across the north of the island to mark the frontier and to control movement. In the east, the empire included Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. These were ancient lands, with their own long histories, rich cultures, and proud traditions. The cities of the east were larger, wealthier, and more sophisticated than most cities in the west. Alexandria in Egypt was a great center of learning, with a famous library and museum. Antioch in Syria was a major commercial hub. Ephesus in Asia Minor was a beautiful city, with a magnificent temple to the goddess Artemis. The people of the East spoke Greek, not Latin. Greek was the language of culture, commerce, and administration in the eastern provinces. Roman officials had to know Greek to govern effectively. Many educated Romans were bilingual, fluent in both Latin and Greek. Egypt was unique. It was immensely wealthy, producing vast quantities of grain that fed Rome. The Nile River, with its annual floods, made the land extraordinarily fertile. Egyptian grain was so important that Augustus made Egypt his personal possession, not a regular province. Only the emperor's appointees could govern it. Senators were forbidden to visit Egypt without the emperor's permission. The eastern provinces also contained Judea, the homeland of the Jewish people. The Jews were unusual in the Roman world because they worshipped only one god and refused to worship the emperor or the traditional Roman gods. This caused tension. The Romans generally tolerated different religions, but they expected everyone to show respect to the emperor and to participate in civic religious rituals. The Jews' refusal was seen as stubborn, even disloyal. Still, the Romans allowed the Jews to practice their religion, granted them exemptions from certain requirements, and usually tried to avoid provoking them. But there were periodic uprisings, brutally suppressed by Roman forces. The relationship between Rome and Judea was fraught, marked by misunderstanding, resentment, and sporadic violence. The frontiers of the empire were defended by legions, professional soldiers who served for 25 years. A legion was a formidable military unit, about 5,000 men, highly trained and disciplined. Legionaries were Roman citizens. They were well paid, well equipped, and given a grant of land when they retired. Supporting the legions were auxiliary units, non-citizen soldiers recruited from the provinces. Auxiliaries served for 25 years, and upon discharge, they were granted Roman citizenship. This was a powerful incentive. A young man from Gaul or Syria could join the auxiliaries, serve his term, and become a Roman citizen, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. His children would be citizens from birth. The auxiliaries provided specialized troops. Some were cavalry, others archers, others light infantry. They supplemented the legions, adding flexibility to Roman armies. They also spread Roman culture, as soldiers moved from one province to another, retired and settled in new places. The army was not only a fighting force, it was also a construction force. Soldiers built roads, bridges, aqueducts, forts, and walls. They quarried stone, felled timber, dug ditches. Military engineering was a crucial part of Roman military success. Good roads allowed armies to move quickly. Strong forts provided bases and refugees. Bridges enabled rivers to be crossed. All of this was built by soldiers. A soldier's life was hard but structured. He woke early, drilled, practiced with weapons, marched carrying heavy packs. He dug ditches, built fortifications, stood guard. He ate simple food, mostly grain made into porridge or bread, with some vegetables, cheese, and occasionally meat. He slept in barracks, sharing a room with 7 other men. He had little privacy, little comfort, but he had comradeship, a sense of purpose, and the promise of a better future. Discipline was strict. Punishments for disobedience or cowardice were severe. A soldier who fell asleep on guard duty could be executed. A unit that fled from battle could be decimated. But the army also rewarded loyalty and bravery. Soldiers who fought well received decorations, bonuses, promotions. Veterans were respected, honored, given land. The empire, for all its size and diversity, was remarkably interconnected. Roads linked every province to Rome. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying goods, people, and ideas. A merchant in Alexandria could send goods to Rome, to Gaul, to Spain. A traveller could journey from Syria to Britain, staying in Roman towns, using Roman roads, protected by Roman law. Latin and Greek were the languages of administration and trade. If you spoke one or both, you could communicate across the empire. Local languages persisted, of course. People in Gaul spoke Gaulish. People in Egypt spoke Egyptian. People in Judea spoke Aramaic. But Latin and Greek were the languages of power, the languages that opened doors. Roman law was another unifying force. It was complex, detailed, and constantly evolving, but its principles were consistent. It protected property, enforced contracts, and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes. Roman citizens had legal rights that were respected throughout the empire. They could not be arbitrarily arrested, tortured, or executed. They had the right to a trial, to present evidence, to appeal. Non-citizens had fewer rights, but Roman law still applied to them in many situations. The law was administered by governors, by local magistrates, by courts. It was not always fair. The rich and powerful could manipulate the system, bribe judges, intimidate witnesses. But the existence of a legal framework, of rules and procedures, was itself significant. It provided a degree of order, predictability, and justice. Trade flourished under the Roman peace, the Pax Romana. The empire's size and stability created a vast market. Goods produced in one region could be sold in another. Wine from Italy was exported to Gaul, to Britain, to Egypt. Olive oil from Spain was shipped to Rome, to Syria, to Greece. Grain from Egypt fed Rome and other cities. Pottery from Gaul was sold across the Western Empire. Glass from Syria was prized everywhere. Luxury goods traveled long distances. Silk came from China, along trade routes through Central Asia and Persia. Spices came from India, carried by sea and overland. Ivory came from Africa. Amber came from the Baltic. These goods were expensive, affordable only to the wealthy, but their availability showed the extent of Roman trade networks. Slavery was integral to the Roman economy. Slaves worked in mines, on farms, in workshops, in households. They were a source of cheap labor, essential to the functioning of the economy. Slaves were property, with no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, beaten, killed. Their lives were often harsh, sometimes brutal. But the lives of slaves varied greatly. A slave working in a mine had a short, miserable existence. A slave working in a household might be treated relatively well, might develop a relationship with the owner, might be educated and given responsibilities. Some slaves were skilled, working as artisans, teachers, doctors, or administrators. These slaves were valuable, treated with some care. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was common in Rome. Owners might free slaves in their wills as a reward for loyal service. Slaves might buy their freedom, saving money given to them by their owners or earned through side work. Freed slaves, freedmen became Roman citizens, though with some restrictions. They could not hold certain offices, but they could engage in business, own property, and pass full citizenship to their children. This meant that the citizen body of Rome was constantly being renewed and expanded. Slaves from Greece, from Syria, from Gaul, from anywhere in the empire could become freedmen, could become citizens, could become Romans. Their children were citizens from birth, fully equal. This fluidity was unusual in the ancient world and was one of Rome's strengths. The family remained the basic unit of Roman society. The household, the familia, included not only parents and children, but also slaves, freedmen, and sometimes extended family. The paterfamilias, the male head, had authority, but the household functioned as a cooperative unit. Everyone had roles, responsibilities, and contributions to make. Women's roles were primarily domestic, but this did not mean they were powerless. Roman women, especially those of the upper classes, could own property, could inherit, could manage estates. They could exert influence through their husbands, sons, and fathers. Some women were highly educated, well-read, politically astute. They hosted salons where poets, philosophers, and politicians gathered. They corresponded with important men, offering advice, making requests, shaping decisions. Ordinary women, of course, had less influence and less freedom. They worked in fields, in shops, in workshops. They raised children, managed households, contributed to the family's survival. Their lives were hard, their options limited, but they were not passive or invisible. They participated in religious festivals, in neighborhood life, in the daily commerce of the streets. Children were raised according to strict norms. Respect for elders, obedience to authority, and devotion to family were emphasized. Fathers had legal power over their children, even adult children. A father could refuse to recognize a newborn, leaving it to be exposed, to die, or to be picked up by someone else. He could arrange his children's marriages, could punish them, could, in theory, even execute them, though this was extremely rare and socially disapproved. In practice, Most fathers were not tyrants. They cared for their children, provided for them, and wanted them to succeed. Mothers, too, were deeply involved in raising children, teaching them, shaping their character. The bond between parent and child was strong, affectionate, and central to Roman life. Education varied by class. The children of the poor received little formal education. They learned by doing, by watching, by helping. By the time they were 10 or 12, they were working, contributing to the family's income. The children of the wealthy received extensive education. Boys studied literature, history, philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics. They were taught to speak and write well, to argue persuasively, to think critically. Girls received less formal education, but many were taught to read, to manage households, to be cultured and refined. Teachers were usually Greek slaves or freedmen, hired by wealthy families or running small schools. The methods were traditional. Students memorized texts, recited passages, practiced writing. Discipline was strict. Teachers used corporal punishment freely, beating students who made mistakes or misbehaved. Higher education was available for those who could afford it. Young men might go to Athens or Rhodes to study philosophy, rhetoric, or law. These were finishing schools where they polished their skills, made connections, and prepared for public life. The experience of studying abroad, of living in a foreign city, of engaging with different ideas, shaped many Roman leaders. Religion continued to be important, though it was changing. The traditional gods were still worshipped, but new cults were spreading. Mystery religions, which promised personal salvation and a blessed afterlife, attracted many followers. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, was popular, especially among women. The cult of Mithras, a Persian god, was popular among soldiers. These cults offered something that the traditional Roman religion did not: a personal relationship with the divine, initiation into secret knowledge, hope for life after death. Christianity, which had begun in Judea, was also spreading, though it was still a small, marginal movement. Christians worshipped Jesus, whom they believed to be the Son of God, who had died and been resurrected. They believed in one God, rejected the traditional gods, and refused to worship the emperor. This made them suspect, even dangerous in the eyes of Roman authorities. Christians were occasionally persecuted, blamed for disasters, accused of disloyalty. But persecution was sporadic, local, not systematic. Most of the time, Christians were left alone as long as they kept a low profile. They met in private homes, celebrated their rituals in secret, and slowly built their communities. The emperors who followed Augustus varied in ability and character. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, succeeded him. Tiberius was a capable general and administrator, but he was also suspicious, reclusive, and unpopular. He spent much of his reign away from Rome, on the island of Capri, leaving the city to be governed by his subordinates. After Tiberius came Caligula, whose short reign was marked by erratic behavior, cruelty, and extravagance. He was assassinated by his own guards. Claudius, his uncle, succeeded him. Claudius was underestimated because of a stammer and a limp, but he proved to be a capable ruler. He conquered southern Britain, reformed the administration, and built infrastructure, including a new port for Rome at Ostia. Nero, who succeeded Claudius, was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The line descended from Augustus. Nero was young when he became emperor, and initially he ruled well, guided by advisors. But over time, he became more autocratic, more erratic, more cruel. He was interested in the arts, in music and theatre, and he performed publicly, which scandalized the Roman elite. Emperors were supposed to be dignified, serious, and restrained. Nero was none of these things. A great fire destroyed much of Rome during Nero's reign. Nero was blamed, though it is unclear whether he was responsible. He used the cleared land to build a vast palace, the Golden House, a sprawling complex of buildings, gardens, and artificial lakes. The extravagance offended many. Nero also persecuted Christians, blaming them for the fire. This was one of the first organized persecutions of Christians, and it left a lasting impression. Nero's rule ended in rebellion. Governors and generals turned against him. The Senate condemned him. Nero fled Rome and committed suicide. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into a brief civil war as several generals competed for the throne. The year 69 of the Common Era is known as the Year of the Four Emperors. 4 men claimed the throne in succession, each supported by different legions and factions. There was fighting in Italy, in Gaul, in the East. The civil war was brief but destructive. Finally, Vespasian, a general who had been campaigning in Judea, emerged victorious. He marched to Rome and established a new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was a practical, down-to-earth man. He came from a modest background, not an ancient aristocratic family. He had risen through the ranks by ability and hard work. As emperor, he restored order, replenished the treasury, which Nero had emptied, and began rebuilding the city. He started construction of the Colosseum, a massive amphitheatre in the center of Rome, on the site of Nero's Golden House. It was a symbolic gesture, returning to the people the land that Nero had taken for himself. The Colosseum, when completed, could hold 50,000 spectators. It was used for gladiatorial games, animal hunts, mock battles, and other spectacles. The construction was a marvel of engineering. The building was oval, with tiers of seats rising in concentric rings. There were passages and rooms beneath the arena floor, where animals and gladiators waited before appearing. Trapdoors allowed them to be raised suddenly into the arena, creating dramatic entrances. Vespasian ruled for 10 years. He was succeeded by his son Titus, who reigned for only 2 years but was remembered fondly. Titus completed the Colosseum and dedicated it with games that lasted 100 days. He also dealt with disasters, including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in ash and lava. The eruption of Vesuvius was sudden and catastrophic. The volcano, which had been dormant for centuries, exploded in the year 79. Ash and pumice rained down on Pompeii, burying the city. Poisonous gases killed those who had not fled. Herculaneum was buried by a pyroclastic flow, a fast-moving current of hot gas and rock. Thousands died. The buried cities were forgotten for centuries. When they were excavated in modern times, they provided an extraordinary snapshot of Roman life. Houses, shops, temples, theatres, all preserved under the ash. Bread still in ovens, wine jars still sealed, graffiti on walls. The bodies of the dead, their forms preserved in the hardened ash, showed people in their last moments, fleeing, sheltering, dying. Titus's younger brother Domitian succeeded him. Domitian was a capable administrator, but also autocratic and paranoid. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, which offended many Romans. He persecuted senators he suspected of disloyalty, conducted treason trials, and confiscated property. His reign ended in assassination, murdered by his own household staff. After Domitian, the Senate chose an elderly, respected senator named Nerva as emperor. Nerva was a compromise, a safe choice, but he was old and had no heir. He adopted a capable and popular general, Trajan, as his son and successor. This set a precedent. For the next century, emperors would choose their successors based on ability, adopting them, rather than passing power to biological sons. This period is often called the era of the 5 good emperors, a time of peace, prosperity, and effective government. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 of the Common Era, was the first emperor born outside Italy. He came from Spain. He was a soldier, a general who had commanded legions on the Rhine frontier. As emperor, he expanded the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia, a region north of the Danube rich in gold, and campaigning in the east, briefly annexing Armenia and Mesopotamia. Trajan was also a builder. He constructed a new forum in Rome, Trajan's Forum, a vast complex of public buildings, markets, and a monumental column. Trajan's column still stands, a tall marble column covered in a spiral relief showing scenes from the Dacian Wars. It is both a work of art and a historical record, showing Roman soldiers fighting, building, marching, celebrating. Trajan was popular, respected by the Senate, admired by the army, loved by the people. He ruled fairly, avoided unnecessary cruelty, and maintained the fiction that he was merely the first citizen, not a king. Later, emperors looked back on his reign as a golden age. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, was very different. He was intellectual, cultured, restless. He loved Greek culture, wore a Greek-style beard, wrote poetry, and studied philosophy. He travelled constantly, visiting every province of the empire, inspecting troops, founding cities, building monuments. Hadrian abandoned some of Trajan's conquests. He believed the empire had reached its natural limits, that further expansion would overextend resources. He focused on consolidating, on strengthening the frontiers. In Britain, he built Hadrian's Wall, a stone barrier stretching 73 miles across the north of the island, from coast to coast. The wall marked the edge of the empire, controlled movement, and served as a base for troops. Hadrian also built extensively. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, a temple to all the gods, with a magnificent dome. The Pantheon's dome is a marvel. It is made of concrete with a circular opening at the top, the oculus, that lets in light. The dome is perfectly proportioned, a symbol of the heavens, the eternal. The Pantheon still stands, largely intact, one of the best preserved Roman buildings. Hadrian's reign was generally peaceful and prosperous. He promoted the arts, supported education, reformed the legal system. But he could also be ruthless. He suppressed a Jewish revolt in Judea with great violence. Jerusalem was destroyed, the Jewish population was killed or enslaved, and Jews were forbidden to enter the city. A new city, Aelia Capitolina, was built on the site, a Roman city with Roman temples. This was a devastating blow to the Jewish people, a trauma that shaped their history for centuries. Antoninus Pius, who succeeded Hadrian, ruled for 23 years, the longest reign since Augustus. His reign was peaceful, uneventful, prosperous. He rarely left Italy, governing from Rome, maintaining the empire's stability through careful administration. He was called pious, dutiful, or devout for his piety and his respect for tradition. His reign is often seen as the high point of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Marcus Aurelius, who succeeded Antoninus Pius, was a philosopher-emperor. He was a Stoic, a follower of a philosophy that taught virtue, reason, and acceptance of fate. He wrote a book, The Meditations, a series of personal reflections on life, duty, and the nature of the universe. The Meditations were not written for publication. They were private notes, reminders to himself, thoughts on how to live well, how to endure hardship, how to rule justly. Marcus Aurelius's reign was difficult. The empire faced invasions on the frontiers, plagues that killed millions, and internal unrest. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube, raiding deep into Roman territory. Marcus spent much of his reign on campaign, leading armies, defending the frontiers. He was not a natural soldier, but he did his duty, enduring the hardships, the cold, the danger. The plague, which struck in the middle of his reign, was devastating. It may have been smallpox or measles brought back by soldiers returning from the east. It spread rapidly, killing a large portion of the population. Cities were depopulated, farms were abandoned, trade was disrupted. The economy suffered, tax revenues fell, and the empire's strength was sapped. Despite these challenges, Marcus Aurelius ruled with integrity and wisdom. He was respected, admired, seen as a model of the philosopher king. But he made one significant mistake. He broke with the tradition of adopting a capable successor, and instead passed the throne to his biological son, Commodus. Commodus was the opposite of his father. He was vain, cruel, self-indulgent. He had no interest in governing. He preferred to spend his time fighting in the arena as a gladiator, which shocked and disgusted the Roman elite. Emperors were supposed to be dignified, serious, above such things. Commodus saw himself as a new Hercules, a warrior hero. He wore a lion skin, carried a club, and demanded to be worshipped as a god. His reign was chaotic. He ignored the Senate, left administration to favorites and freedmen, squandered the treasury on games and personal pleasures. Conspiracies formed against him. Finally, he was assassinated, strangled in his bath by a wrestler. His death ended the era of the 5 good emperors and ushered in a period of instability. The 3rd century of the Common Era was a time of crisis for the Roman Empire. The system that had provided stability, the adoption of capable successors, had broken down. Emperors were made and unmade by the army. Soldiers, especially the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops stationed in Rome, realized they could choose emperors, could demand bribes for their loyalty, could kill those who displeased them. In the 3rd century, dozens of men claimed the title of emperor. Most reigned for only a few years, some for only a few months. They were generals, elevated by their legions, who marched on Rome, seized power, and were then overthrown by rivals. Civil wars were frequent, destructive, and demoralizing. The frontiers were breached. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding Gaul, Greece, even Italy. In the east, a new power had arisen, the Sasanian Persian Empire, which replaced the Parthians. The Sasanians were aggressive, ambitious, and well organized. They invaded Roman territory, captured cities, even took a Roman emperor, Valerian, prisoner. Valerian died in captivity, a humiliation for Rome. The economy suffered. Constant warfare disrupted trade. The coinage was debased, the silver content reduced, causing inflation. Prices rose, wages fell, and the standard of living declined. Cities shrank, some were abandoned. The population fell, partly due to plague, which struck again, partly due to war and economic collapse. The empire seemed on the verge of disintegration. Some provinces broke away, forming independent states. In Gaul, a Gallic empire was established, claiming to be the legitimate successor to Rome. In the east, the city of Palmyra, led by a queen named Zenobia, carved out an empire that included Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. But the empire did not fall. A series of soldier emperors, tough, capable generals, fought to restore order. They defeated the breakaway states, drove back the invaders, and re-established the frontiers. These emperors, often called the barracks emperors because they were chosen by the army, were not refined or cultured. They were hard men from the provinces, often from humble backgrounds, but they were effective. The Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275, reconquered the Gallic Empire and defeated Palmyra. He brought Zenobia back to Rome in chains, paraded her in his triumph, and then, in a gesture of clemency, gave her a villa and a pension. Aurelian also built a new set of walls around Rome, the Aurelian Walls, a recognition that the city itself was no longer safe, that it needed to be defended. The crisis was stabilized by Diocletian, who became emperor in 284. Diocletian was a reformer, a reorganizer. He recognized that the empire was too large, too complex for one man to govern. He divided it into eastern and western halves, each ruled by an emperor called an Augustus. Each Augustus had a junior colleague called a Caesar who would assist him and eventually succeed him. This system, the tetrarchy, the rule of four, was designed to provide stability and ensure smooth succession. Diocletian also reformed the administration, dividing provinces into smaller units, creating a more centralized bureaucracy, increasing the number of officials. He reformed the army, increasing its size, creating mobile field armies to respond to threats, and strengthening the frontier defenses. He reformed the tax system, making it more efficient, more predictable, more oppressive. Diocletian's reforms stabilized the empire, but they also transformed it. The empire became more bureaucratic, more authoritarian, more regimented. The old ideal of the emperor as first citizen, a partner with the Senate, was abandoned. The emperor was now a remote, autocratic figure, surrounded by ceremony, addressed with oriental titles like Lord and God. The Senate's role was reduced to that of a municipal council for the city of Rome. Real power lay with the emperor and his officials. Diocletian also persecuted Christians. He saw Christianity as a threat to traditional Roman values, to the unity of the empire. He ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of Christian scriptures, the arrest of clergy. Christians who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods were tortured, executed, sent to the mines. This was the last and most severe persecution of Christians, and it failed. Christianity had grown too strong, too widespread. The persecutions created martyrs whose courage inspired others, and they ended without achieving their goal. Diocletian retired in 305, the only Roman emperor to voluntarily give up power. He retired to a palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast and spent his remaining years growing cabbages. His retirement was peaceful, but the tetrarchy did not survive him. The system broke down, rivalries emerged, and the empire was again plunged into civil war. The winner was Constantine, the son of one of the Caesars. Constantine reunited the empire under his rule, defeating his rivals in a series of campaigns. He is remembered for two things. First, he converted to Christianity. According to tradition, before a battle, he saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He adopted the Christian symbol, won the battle, and credited his victory to the Christian God. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious toleration to Christians and ended persecution. Christianity, once a marginal, persecuted sect, now had imperial support. Constantine donated land and money to the church, built churches including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and favoured Christians in his administration. The conversion of Constantine did not make the empire Christian overnight. Most people were still pagan, still worshipped the traditional gods, but Christianity now had momentum. It grew rapidly, attracting converts from all classes, all regions. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity would be the dominant religion, and paganism would be in retreat. Constantine's second major act was the founding of a new capital. He chose the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, on the Bosphorus, the strait separating Europe and Asia. The location was strategic, controlling the passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, closer to the wealthy eastern provinces, easier to defend than Rome. Constantine rebuilt and expanded the city, renaming it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was built on a grand scale, with palaces, churches, forums, aqueducts, walls. It was a Christian city, with no pagan temples. It became the new centre of the empire, though Rome remained important symbolically. The empire Constantine ruled was different from the empire of Augustus. It was Christian, or becoming so. It was more bureaucratic, more centralized, more militarized. The economy was more controlled, with fixed prices, hereditary occupations, heavy taxation. Society was more hierarchical, with sharper divisions between classes, less mobility. The old civic culture, the public games and festivals, the pride in citizenship was fading. People identified less with the empire, more with their local region, their religion, their patron. The cities were shrinking, their populations declining, their public buildings falling into disrepair. The countryside was dominated by large estates, worked by tenant farmers who were tied to the land, almost like serfs. The Senate in Rome had lost most of its power. It was a body of wealthy landowners, of ancient families, who clung to their status and their traditions. They were largely pagan, resistant to Christianity, nostalgic for the old republic. But they had little influence on policy, little role in government. Real power lay with the emperor, his court, the bureaucracy, and the army. The emperor's court was elaborate, formal, hierarchical. The emperor was surrounded by eunuchs, chamberlains, secretaries, bodyguards. Access to the emperor was controlled, and favor was everything. Officials competed for the emperor's attention, schemed against rivals, and accumulated wealth and power. The bureaucracy was vast and complex. There were offices for finance, for the army, for the provinces, for the imperial household. Each had its own hierarchy, its own officials, its own procedures. Paperwork proliferated. Everything had to be documented, recorded, filed. The bureaucracy was slow, often corrupt, but it kept the empire functioning. The army was the backbone of the state. It defended the frontiers, suppressed revolts, and ensured obedience. Soldiers were well paid, well supplied, and privileged. They were exempt from many taxes, had access to courts, and could expect land or a pension when they retired. The army was also the path to power. Almost all emperors in the later empire came from the army, were generals who had commanded legions, who had the loyalty of their troops. The 4th century saw the empire divided again, this time more permanently. Constantine's successors fought over the throne, dividing the empire between them, reuniting it, dividing it again. Gradually, the eastern and western halves became distinct, with different administrations, different priorities, different fates. The Western Empire faced greater challenges. It was poorer, less urbanized, more vulnerable to invasion. The frontiers were long and difficult to defend. Germanic tribes, pushed by movements of peoples further east, crossed the Rhine and Danube in growing numbers. Some came as raiders, others as migrants seeking land and safety. The Romans, lacking manpower, sometimes allowed these tribes to settle within the empire, granting them land in exchange for military service. These tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, were settled in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa. They were supposed to defend the empire, but increasingly they acted independently, following their own leaders, pursuing their own interests. In 378, a Roman army was defeated by the Goths at the Battle of Adrianople in Thrace. The Emperor Valens was killed, along with much of the army. The defeat was a shock, a sign that Rome's military superiority was no longer assured. The Goths were allowed to settle within the empire, nominally as allies, but in reality as an independent power. The Western Empire was weakening. Emperors were increasingly puppets, controlled by Germanic generals who held the real power. The city of Rome itself was no longer the capital of the West. The emperor and his court moved to Ravenna, a more defensible city on the Adriatic coast. In 410, the Goths, led by their king Alaric, sacked Rome. They captured the city, looted it, and held it for 3 days before leaving. The sack was not as destructive as it might have been. Alaric was a Christian, and he ordered his men to spare churches and those who took refuge in them. But the psychological impact was enormous. Rome, the eternal city, the center of the world, had fallen to barbarians. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been captured by an enemy. The news of the sack spread across the empire. Some saw it as a sign of God's judgment, a punishment for Rome's sins. Others saw it as the end of an era, the collapse of a world order. The Christian writer Augustus wrote The City of God in response, arguing that earthly cities, even Rome, were temporary, that true citizenship was in the heavenly city, the city of God. Over the next decades, more of the Western Empire was lost. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, captured Carthage, and established a kingdom. North Africa, the breadbasket of the West, was gone. The Visigoths settled in Spain. The Franks took over Gaul. Britain was abandoned, left to fend for itself against Saxon invaders. The Western emperors became figureheads, powerless, dependent on Germanic generals. In 476, the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. He ruled Italy as king, nominally under the authority of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. But in reality, the Western Empire was over. The date 476 is often given as the end of the Roman Empire in the West, but the end was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual transformation, a slow blending of Roman and Germanic cultures. Roman institutions, Roman law, Roman language all continued. The Church, now the most stable institution, preserved literacy, learning, and Roman traditions. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. Constantinople remained a great city, wealthy, populous, cultured. The Eastern emperors saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, the legitimate successors of Augustus. They spoke Greek rather than Latin, but they preserved Roman law, Roman administration, Roman imperial ideals. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled in the 6th century, attempted to reconquer the West. His generals reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief time, it seemed the empire might be reunited, the old glory restored. But the conquests were costly, difficult to hold. Italy was devastated by decades of warfare, depopulated, impoverished. The effort exhausted the empire's resources. Justinian is also remembered for codifying Roman law. He ordered scholars to compile all existing Roman laws, legal opinions, and imperial decrees into a single, organized system. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This compilation preserved Roman legal principles, ensured their transmission to later ages, and influenced legal systems across Europe and beyond. The Corpus Juris Civilis included the Institutes, a textbook for law students, the Digest, a collection of legal opinions from famous jurists, the Code, a compilation of imperial decrees, and the novels, new laws issued by Justinian himself. Together they formed a comprehensive legal system, sophisticated, detailed, and rooted in centuries of Roman experience. Roman law emphasized certain principles. It protected property rights, enforced contracts, provided procedures for resolving disputes. It distinguished between different types of law: civil law, which governed relations between citizens, and natural law, which was based on reason and applied to all people. It recognized the rights of individuals, the importance of evidence, the need for fair procedures. These principles survived the fall of the Western Empire. They were studied in medieval universities, adapted by European kingdoms, incorporated into national legal codes. Roman law became the foundation of the civil law tradition, one of the world's major legal systems, still influential today. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the West were not entirely alien. The kings and their peoples admired Roman culture, adopted Roman titles, employed Roman administrators, issued laws in Latin. They saw themselves, in some sense, as continuing Rome, as ruling with Rome's authority. The Frankish kingdom in Gaul eventually became the most powerful. Under a dynasty called the Carolingians, the Franks expanded, conquering neighbouring peoples, consolidating their rule. The greatest Carolingian king was Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who ruled from 768 to 814. Charlemagne was a warrior, a conqueror, a patron of learning. He expanded the Frankish kingdom to include much of Western Europe, France, Germany, northern Italy, parts of Spain. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as emperor of the Romans. This was a bold claim, a revival of the Western Empire, though the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople did not recognize it. Charlemagne's empire did not last. It was divided among his grandsons and fragmented into smaller kingdoms. But the idea persisted. The title of Holy Roman Emperor continued for 1,000 years, claimed by German kings who saw themselves as heirs of Rome and Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire, as it was called, was a loose confederation, not a centralized state, but it kept alive the memory of Rome, the idea of a universal Christian empire. The Church, too, preserved Rome's legacy. Latin remained the language of the Church, of liturgy, of theology. The Church's structure, with bishops overseeing dioceses, archbishops overseeing provinces, and the Pope in Rome claiming authority over all, mirrored the Roman administrative system. Monasteries became centers of learning, where monks copied manuscripts, preserving classical texts, Roman histories, Latin literature. The Benedictine order, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, played a crucial role. Benedictine monks followed a rule, a set of guidelines for communal living. They prayed, worked, studied. They cultivated fields, built workshops, and maintained libraries. They educated the sons of nobles, trained priests, and served as advisors to kings. Through the monasteries, through the church, through the legal codes, Roman culture survived. It blended with Germanic traditions, with Christian teachings, and evolved into something new. Medieval Europe was not Rome, but it was built on Rome's foundations, shaped by Rome's legacy. The concept of citizenship, so central to Rome, faded. In the medieval world, identity was based on religion, on local ties, on personal loyalty to a lord. People were Christians, not citizens. They belonged to a village, a manor, a kingdom, not to a universal state. But the memory of Roman citizenship, of a community bound by law, of rights and responsibilities, did not disappear entirely. It was studied, discussed, remembered. In the later Middle Ages, as cities grew and trade revived, the idea of citizenship re-emerged. City-states in Italy, like Florence and Venice, revived republican ideals, studied Roman history, and modelled their governments on Rome. The Renaissance, the great cultural flowering of the 14th and 15th centuries, was in many ways a rediscovery of Rome. Scholars studied Latin and Greek, read Roman authors, collected Roman manuscripts. Artists studied Roman sculpture, Roman architecture, sought to recreate the beauty and proportion of classical art. Thinkers looked to Roman philosophy, Roman history, for guidance on ethics, politics, and human nature. The rediscovery of Rome influenced the modern world profoundly. The American and French revolutions drew on Roman republican ideals. The founders of the United States studied Roman history, debated the causes of Rome's fall, and designed a constitution to avoid Rome's mistakes. They created a republic with separation of powers, checks and balances, a senate, all inspired by Rome. The physical remnants of Rome are still visible. The Colosseum stands in the center of Rome, a tourist attraction, a symbol of ancient grandeur. The Pantheon is still used, now as a church. Roman aqueducts still carry water in some places. Roman roads still run through Europe, some paved over, others abandoned, but their routes still followed. Excavations continue to uncover Roman sites, Roman buildings, Roman artifacts. Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried by Vesuvius, have been extensively excavated, revealing streets, houses, shops, all frozen in time. These sites allow us to see how Romans lived, what they ate, how they decorated their homes, what they wrote on their walls. Roman literature survives. We can read Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's Odes, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Cicero's speeches, Caesar's commentaries, Tacitus's histories, all in the original Latin or in translation. These works are studied, taught, enjoyed. They connect us to the Romans, to their thoughts, their feelings, their world. Roman engineering principles are still studied. The arch, the dome, the use of concrete, all Roman innovations, influenced architecture for centuries. Roman surveying techniques, Roman road-building methods, Roman water management systems, all demonstrated a practical, problem-solving approach that is still admired. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. These languages are spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. Latin itself remains important in certain fields. Medicine, law, science all use Latin terms. The Catholic Church still uses Latin in some contexts. Roman law, as mentioned, influenced legal systems across the world. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty, the right to a fair trial, the importance of written law, all have roots in Roman legal tradition. The civil law systems of much of Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia are based on Roman law. The idea of empire, of a large, diverse state united under a single government, is a Roman legacy. The British Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all drew inspiration from Rome, saw themselves as heirs to Rome's universal ambition. Even today, when we speak of empires of imperial power, we are using Roman concepts, Roman language. But Rome's legacy is complex, contested. Rome was an empire built on conquest, on slavery, on the exploitation of others. It brought peace and prosperity to some, suffering and oppression to others. It spread culture and learning, but also imposed its will by force. It created systems of law and order, but also systems of domination and control. How we remember Rome, how we judge Rome, depends on perspective. For some, Rome is a model of civilization, of order, of achievement. For others, it is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of power, of the costs of empire. The Romans themselves were aware of these contradictions. They celebrated their virtues, their discipline, their piety, their courage. But they also worried about corruption, about luxury, about the loss of the old values. Roman writers often looked back to an imagined past, a simpler, purer time, and lamented the decadence of the present. This tension between ideal and reality, between aspiration and achievement, is part of Rome's story. The Romans were not perfect. They made mistakes, committed crimes, failed to live up to their own ideals. But they also achieved extraordinary things, created enduring institutions, and left a legacy that shaped the world. The people who lived in the Roman Empire were, in the end, people much like us. They loved and hated, hoped and feared, worked and rested. They faced challenges, made choices, tried to build good lives for themselves and their families. They were shaped by their time, by their culture, by the opportunities and constraints they faced. But they were also individuals, with their own thoughts, their own dreams, their own stories. Most of their names are lost. We know the emperors, the generals, the poets, the philosophers. We know a few ordinary people whose names appear in inscriptions, in papyri, in graffiti, but millions lived and died without leaving a trace, without a record. They are anonymous, forgotten, yet they were the ones who built the roads, farmed the fields, manned the legions, raised the children. They were Rome. Their lives were often hard. They faced disease, hunger, war, oppression. They had fewer choices, fewer freedoms, fewer comforts than most people today. But they also had moments of joy, of beauty, of connection. They watched sunsets, tasted wine, heard music, felt love. They were fully human, fully alive. The story of Rome is their story. It is the story of a city that grew into an empire, that dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, that shaped Western civilization, and that finally fell, leaving behind ruins, memories, and a legacy that endures. The ruins speak of grandeur, of power, of achievement. They remind us of what humans can build, what they can create when they work together, when they apply their intelligence and their energy to a common purpose. But the ruins also speak of impermanence, of the passage of time, of the inevitability of decline and fall. Even the greatest empires, the mightiest cities, do not last forever. The memories are preserved in stories, in histories, in myths. They tell of heroes and villains, of triumphs and disasters, of great deeds and terrible crimes. They are passed down, generation to generation, retold, reinterpreted, kept alive. These memories shape how we see ourselves, how we understand our past, how we imagine our future. The legacy is woven into our languages, our laws, our institutions, our ideas. It is in the words we speak, the buildings we construct, the governments we create, the values we hold. Rome is not gone. It lives on, transformed, adapted, blended with other traditions, but still present, still influential. And so the story continues, quietly, without drama. The river Tiber still flows through Rome, past the ruins, past the churches, past the modern city that has grown up around and over the ancient one. The hills are still there, though they are covered now with buildings, with streets, with the noise and bustle of contemporary life. Tourists visit, walking through the Forum, standing in the Colosseum, gazing at the Pantheon. They take photographs, buy souvenirs, try to imagine what it was like, what the Romans saw, what they felt. Some are moved, touched by a sense of connection to the past. Others are simply curious, interested in history, in architecture, in the strange and distant world of ancient Rome. The sun sets over Rome as it has for thousands of years. The light fades, the shadows lengthen, the city grows quiet. Somewhere, someone is reading Virgil, studying Latin, thinking about Augustus, writing about the fall of the empire. The conversation continues, the interest persists, the fascination remains. Rome is a mirror in which we see ourselves. We see our ambitions, our achievements, our failures, our hopes. We see what we might become, what we might build, what we might lose. We see that all things pass, that all glory is temporary, that all empires fall. But we also see that something endures, ideas endure, stories endure. The works of human hands and minds, though they may crumble and fade, leave traces, leave echoes, leave lessons. And these lessons, these echoes, these traces, connect us across the centuries, connect us to those who came before, remind us that we are part of a long story, a story that began long ago and continues still. The night deepens. The stars appear, the same stars that Roman farmers watched, that Roman soldiers navigated by, that Roman poets wrote about. The world turns, as it always has, carrying us forward into tomorrow, into the unknown, into whatever comes next. Rest now. The story of Rome has been told, or at least a part of it. There is always more, always another detail, another life, another moment. But this is enough. Let it settle, like dust after a long journey. Let it rest, like seeds planted in soil. Let it simply be this story of a city, of an empire, of people who lived long ago and are gone now, but who left something behind, something that whispers still, something that endures. The Tiber flows, the stars shine, the earth turns, and somewhere someone sleeps, and dreams perhaps of marble columns, of roads stretching to the horizon, of a world that was, and a world that might have been, and a world that, in some small way, still is.